Many of us have always wondered what were the main differences and similarities that Napoleon and Hitler's invasions of Russia had. The first took place on June 24, 1812, when Napoleon entered Russia with an army of more than 500,000 soldiers and headed towards Moscow. His objective was to defeat the Russian army in a major battle, while he headed towards Moscow to conquer it, with which he hoped that Tsar Alexander I would sign a capitulation treaty favorable to France. 129 years later, on June 22, 1941, the German army, with an army of more than 3 million troops, attacked Russia again, this time being a much larger country that was unified into what became known as the Soviet Union. Both men failed in their attempt to defeat the Russians, and while they made some similar mistakes, there were other actions that they did very differently. Next in this program, we are going to analyze what Hitler and Napoleon's invasion of Russia had in common, and what their main differences were. Before starting this comparison, let's look at the exact moment when Hitler and Napoleon shared the same space. This took place on June 23, 1940, when just one day after the surrender of France, Hitler visited the French capital. One of his most peculiar visits was precisely that of Napoleon's tomb, this being one of the European leaders with whom the Führer began to compare himself. As some witnesses commented, Hitler said that that was the day of his life that he was most proud of. Until this date, German war propaganda had compared him to these great strategists, but it was precisely from here on that any reference to Napoleon had to be cut. The reason was clear, and it was none other than the imminent attack that the Germans were going to launch against the Soviet Union. Everyone knew how Napoleon's attempt at the beginning of the last century had ended, so no one thought to make any kind of reference. Thus, the German leader became obsessed with this matter, and he issued several specific orders to avoid repeating any of Napoleon's mistakes. General Jodl, who held the position of Chief of the Operations Staff of the OKW, said that Hitler did not want to launch a single attack through the center of the Soviet Union in the direction of Moscow, to avoid doing precisely the same as Napoleon. Instead, he approved the plan to move forward on 3 main axes simultaneously. Another man who was especially concerned was Joseph Goebbels, who tried by all means to ensure that Napoleon's campaign in Russia could not be compared with what he was going to do with the German army almost 130 years later. On June 13, 1941, just a few days before the invasion began, Goebbels noted the following: "Ours will be a massive, large-scale attack. Without a doubt, the strongest that has ever been seen in history. What happened to Napoleon will not be repeated this time." Another fact to highlight is the chosen date. As we mentioned at the beginning, both attacks began practically on the same day, although the Germans claimed to have attacked at the beginning of May, instead of on June 22. As you know, this delay was mainly due to the improvised intervention that the Germans had to make in Yugoslavia and Greece during the month of April of that same year. This is the event that is always highlighted to explain the reason why winter came before the Germans took Moscow, and many say that this was the main reason for the German failure. However, when we see the time it took Napoleon to reach Moscow, it is clear that the Germans would have had weeks to spare. It took Napoleon only 51 days to reach Moscow, and he took the city on September 14, 1812. Considering that he did not have railways, aviation, or any motorized vehicle, it was an impressive feat. So, and with this in mind, there was nothing to suggest that the modern German army of the mid-20th century would take longer to reach Moscow. However, as you all know, at the beginning of December 1941, after 5 months of offensive, the Germans had still not been able to reach Moscow. Although the German army had some motorized divisions, and had about 35,000 trucks, distributed among its 190 divisions, the Germans also had more than 600,000 horses, which represented their main transportation element. In this way, we see how the way of moving large masses of soldiers across hundreds of kilometers was quite similar on both occasions. In any case, and to close this section, it must be said that Napoleon had many more logistical problems than the Germans, and they experienced numerous difficulties both in his advance towards Moscow and during his retreat from it. The next characteristic that we want to highlight is related to discipline, the morale of the troops, and the quality of the commanders in each of the invasions of Russia. Napoleon depended heavily on his military genius, and was surrounded by many generals who lacked confidence and desire, in this Russian campaign of 1812. Before starting the campaign, Napoleon had gathered his generals in Danzig. Napoleon, captured by gloomy thoughts, said, "I know very well, gentlemen, that you no longer have the desire to fight." Indeed, the marshals were as tired as the soldiers themselves. Napoleon had presented his generals with dukedoms and kingdoms, and these generals had more desire to enjoy their goods than to continue hearing the noise of cannons and smelling gunpowder. It should also be noted that Napoleon himself was ill, and would have gladly avoided the Russian adventure, even if Tsar Alexander had offered him the slightest possibility of reaching peace. Napoleon was then suffering from jaundice, as a result of his liver ailment, and had lost his former spirit. He spent his nights in front of his tent, drinking mulled wine to stay awake, and cursing everything around him. In addition, the morale of the French army was also in decline, and it even suffered many desertions. One of the most famous cases was that of 2,000 Spaniards who began the campaign within Napoleon's army, and ended up joining the Russian side. This event did not happen with the Spanish of the Blue Division 130 years later. On the other hand, the Germans had very good generals who acted on their own in many cases, leading to the greatest military victories to date. Furthermore, the German army was made up of very disciplined men and veterans of previous campaigns, who put all their efforts into defeating their Bolshevik enemy. This ideological factor was one more extra that the German invasion of 1941 had, and that Napoleon's did not have. Having seen this, let's move on to the last point of the program, this being the most important of all. This is the strategy that each of these armies had when they invaded Russia, and what response they obtained from their enemy. First, both the Germans and the French wanted to engage the Russians as soon as possible in a major battle, the outcome of which would quickly conclude the campaign. To be exact, Napoleon's words were as follows: "Only a good battle can ensure peace." However, his opponent shunned him and shunned this battle, this being one of the main reasons why his campaign in Russia failed. For his part, Tsar Alexander did not think at all about a battle and mocked Napoleon with his rearguards of Cossacks who were continually harassing him. In this way, every time the French leader thought he had encountered the enemy en masse, it was nothing more than a rearguard of Cossacks that disappeared into the horizon. The only important battle that took place in this campaign was the one known as the Battle of Borodino, in which the Russians faced the French very close to Moscow, on September 7, 1812. This battle was mainly a symbolic action that Tsar Alexander had to make so that it would not appear that he was abandoning Moscow, and that he had let the French pass without resistance. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow, a city that had been completely devastated by the Russians themselves, before handing it over to the French. Finally, after 6 weeks of occupation, Napoleon ordered a withdrawal that began on October 19, before the harsh Russian winter arrived. This withdrawal occurred because Napoleon could not defeat the bulk of the Russian army, because the Russians barely put up a fight, and because despite having taken Moscow, he did not receive any peace offer from the Tsar. Thus, if the French had remained and destroyed Moscow during the coming winter, they would have been isolated and would have died little by little. On the other hand, we have the German invasion of 1941, which also sought great battles of annihilation, in which to defeat the Soviet armies as soon as possible. Unlike what happened to Napoleon, Stalin was willing to fight the Germans, and to send the greatest number of troops possible to the front. This led to dozens of major battles along the entire Eastern Front, in which the Red Army suffered millions of casualties, and at least another 2 million prisoners during the first months of the invasion. However, and although the Germans won each of these battles, this fierce Soviet resistance managed to progressively wear down the Germans, and delayed their advance. So, before they knew it, the harsh Russian winter was about to enter the scene, while they were still far from Moscow. This forced them to launch their last major offensive with the intention of reaching the Soviet capital, which was known as Operation Typhoon. This last attack began in early October 1941 and ended in early December when the Soviets counterattacked along the entire front. In this way, and as a summary of this section, we can say that Napoleon was defeated by the absence of battles and opportunities to annihilate the Russian armies, while the Germans were defeated by the great ability of the Soviets to rally again and again. At this point, many may wonder if Tsar Alexander and Stalin applied the same scorched earth tactic, razing their cities themselves before they fell into the hands of their enemy. The answer to this is a bit complex. It can be said that both applied the scorched earth tactic, although the Tsar did so without practically resisting the French advance, while Stalin did so once he was defeated in battle. Although it was good for Tsar Alexander to leave the French free, letting the Russian territory in the winter defeat his enemy, why didn't Stalin do the same with the Germans? The truth is that this is totally unthinkable. Firstly, because with the technical means available to the Germans, as well as a much larger army, which allowed them to advance along 3 different axes at the same time, they would have reached the line of Archangel Astrakhan in a very short time. This would have completely dismantled the economic, industrial, and military capacity of the Soviet Union, and it would have been difficult to initiate a counterattack from the Urals. Secondly, Stalin could not have allowed himself to leave his territory defenseless without putting up any kind of resistance. The Bolshevik ideology is very aggressive, and they had been talking for many years about the great expansion they would carry out throughout Europe and other parts of the world. Thus, if he had limited himself to devastating his country without offering any kind of resistance to the German advance, there is no doubt that he would have lost the trust of the Soviet people and would have ended up falling into disgrace.